Welcome to the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. If you want effective and actionable tips to simplify the overwhelm of launching and managing your podcast, then this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Verity Songon, podcast manager, launch strategist, and host of a Top 100 podcast. I'm really excited to have you here, so without further ado, let's dive into the episode.
Hello there and welcome back to the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting, and in this episode we are talking about what's the perfect length for your podcast season. And before we dive in, let us define what is a podcast season and how do you define what a podcast season is and how long a podcast season should be. So first of all, what I want to do is just give you the very short answer that there is no hard and fast rule as to how long a podcast season should be. It depends on so many factors that we're going to explore in this episode. But deciding on your ideal season length can feel like a bit of a challenging task, and you'll want to consider a range of factors such as your target audience, content you're covering, and the overall goals of your podcast. So first of all, let's start off by defining a podcast season. So a podcast season is a set of episodes released at regular intervals, usually weekly or bi-weekly, that follows a specific theme or topic. A podcast season can vary in length, with some lasting only a few episodes, whilst others go on for months or even years. The length of a season is entirely up to you as the podcast host, and as I said before, there is no right or wrong answer as to how long your seasons or your series should be. So what kind of things do you need to consider when you are determining the ideal length for your podcast season? Well, first of all, we're going to go back to one of my favourite words, which is strategy. What is the strategy of your podcast season? What are you hoping to achieve with your podcast season? And next, what we're going to think about is your target audience. So who are you creating the podcast for? What are their listening habits? If your audience wants your content and information quickly, then maybe a shorter season may be more appropriate. But on the other hand, if your audience is loyal and engaged, maybe they want a longer season. The content as well. So factor number 2 is the content that you're covering. If your podcast covers a very broad topic, then you might need a longer season to cover everything that you have to talk about. However, if you have quite a narrow focus for your podcast, a shorter season may be better than a longer one. And you may find that a shorter season you can cover everything that you need to. Additionally, if you're covering a current event or a current trend, a shorter season may be necessary in order for your content to stay relevant. You need to think about your podcasting goals. So are you looking to attract new listeners, retain existing ones, or generate revenue? Because if you're looking to attract new listeners, then potentially a shorter season may be more attractive as it's less commitment for them. However, if you're looking to retain existing listeners, build a community, generate revenue, then maybe a longer season may be more appropriate because it's giving you more of an opportunity to engage with your audience, promote your sponsors, build your credibility and your authority. The next one, and I think this is a biggie, is your production time. How much time do you have to produce and edit each episode, particularly if you're looking at batch creating as well? A shorter season may be more manageable if you have limited time and resources. Guest availability. Again, if you're planning on having guests on your podcast, their availability may dictate the length of your season and also your recording schedule. Consider looking at your competition as well. I'm not saying copy what other people in your niche are doing, but researching what is popular might give you a good indicator as to what your audience might expect from your show. Equally, you might want to do the opposite of what everyone else seems to be doing within your niche in order to stand out and be seen as being a bit of a trailblazer and a bit different. Think about your audience feedback. Your show, after all, as I say so many times, is all about your audience, because you could actually argue that without your audience, do you even have a show? But what has your audience said about previous seasons? Have they expressed a preference to shorter or longer seasons? And if you haven't produced any seasons yet, go and have a look at the reviews on similar podcasts who have done short seasons, who've done long seasons. See if you can get those reviews and see what the similar audience to yours is actually enjoying and liking. Again, though, if you've had your own seasons coming out, have a look at your analytics and really dig deep. Consider, have you seen listens drop off partway through a longer season, for example, because this could also give you really valuable information to help you determine a really ideal season length for you. So now that we've kind of gone over those factors, let's have a little look at the pros and cons of shorter podcast seasons. First of all, short podcast seasons have got the advantage of being typically more manageable to produce, requiring less time and resources, and typically shorter podcast seasons will consist of 10 to 12 episodes. They also provide a sense of urgency for listeners, encouraging them to tune in regularly, and they can allow you to experiment with different formats and topics whilst keeping your audience engaged and excited. However, on the flip side, shorter podcast seasons might not give you enough time to cover a topic adequately and leaving your audience wanting more, which is great because they'll come back, but if they're waiting too long for the more that you're going to give them, they could go elsewhere to get that information. And also, they may not be as attractive to sponsors as there are fewer opportunities for promotion. Pros and cons of longer podcast seasons. First of all, the pros of a longer podcast season is it's giving you more opportunity to engage with your audience, promote sponsorship, and also potentially generate revenue. They allow you to cover a topic more in depth, providing valuable insights and information for your audience, and provide also a sense of continuity, keeping your audience engaged over a more extended period of time. However, again, on the flip side, for the downsides of longer podcast seasons is they require more time and resources to produce, because obviously you're producing more episodes, and that can make them more challenging to manage. Longer seasons do run the risk of becoming repetitive or losing momentum, leading to a decline in listenership, and they may be less attractive to new listeners who might be hesitant to commit to a more extended season. But do remember, all these pros and cons are just my opinions, and they are off the top of head thoughts as well. And remember that not everybody or every podcaster will see the above as pros or cons. So when it comes to tips for structuring your podcast season, once you've decided on the length of your podcast season, you need to consider your structure so that your episodes are as effective as they can be. And this comes back to my favourite word, is strategy, making sure you've got a clear plan and strategy in place. So when it comes to planning your podcast season, consider the following to yourself. First of all, you want to define a clear theme or topic for each episode. Plan out your episodes in advance and use a consistent format for your episodes as well. Incorporate listener feedback and questions, and you can also use cliffhangers or teasers to keep your audience engaged and coming back for your next episode. Your tips for this episode for maximising your podcast potential, as well as structuring your podcast season effectively. It's so important to promote your podcast effectively as well. So promote your podcast on social media and other channels, collaborate with other podcasters or influencers as relevant to your niche and your strategy. Engage your audience through comments and feedback. Use SEO best practices to improve your search rankings, and use analytics to track your audience's listening habits and preferences. So to conclude this episode, determining the ideal length of your podcast season can be a challenging task, but you need to remember that there isn't actually a definitive answer to decide what your ideal podcast season length should be. There are a lot of factors that come into play, as we have already discussed. And ultimately, though, it is your podcast and you need to be comfortable with your production and publication schedule. There's no point in committing to a schedule that just grinds you down and makes you fall out of love with your podcast. So I would highly recommend have a try with different season lengths and see what works best for you and your podcast. Evaluate what you liked or disliked about the seasons and combine this with your audience feedback to choose an ideal season length for your podcast. As ever, I hope you have found this useful and helpful. I would love to hear from you in the DMs over on Instagram or on Twitter at VeritySongon on both, to hear how you are getting on with planning the perfect length for your own podcast seasons. In the meantime, happy podcasting, and I will see you next time.